Good afternoon, everyone. It's really good to be here, partly because there's a frightening array of brains in front of me that I know and respect, but also because it's the people called Methodists that ensured I'm here today. Because when the initial paperwork about the justice seeking church came out, there was no mention of the word peace. But through the participatory process that was created to explore and analyze what does justice mean, the word peace re-emerged. And because of that, I am here today. I don't know if any of you attended or were even the very people saying words to welcome ministers to their stations this year. Will you promote peace and reconciliation in the church and in the world, speak out in the face of injustice, and work towards the visible unity of Christ's church? Is a question put to every Methodist minister when they start at a station. I will. I ask God to help me, and I invite you all to join with me in being signs of peace and reconciliation. What a promise to be made. My talk today covers various different things, and I'll be blunt, is not as polished or as nice as I would like. I'd set aside 2 weeks to slowly work on it, in which the world has been caught up in conflict in Gaza, in which last Thursday I ended up stood in the rain outside Telford International Centre. I was stood beside a man who had been there 2 years before, and in fact had been dispatched from there as worthy to be ordained by the Methodist Church. But we were not stood there to celebrate past Methodist glories. We were there to lament the fact that an alms fair was meeting the other side of the fence in the building to which the Methodist Church is due to return in 2 years' time, and to which the Baptist Assembly will also be going. Makes you think, particularly because on that day, there were many Methodists in Shrewsbury giving thanks for the wonderful life of Reverend Maurice Wright, long-time secretary to the Methodist Peace Fellowship, advocate for peace and justice, whose personal ministry and friendship I encountered, and I know from having seen the beautiful outpouring online, many, many other people did. This juxtaposition of places, people, to me bring to life the very vibrant witness of peace that's at the heart of the Methodist message. Now, as a good Methodist, we need to start with where we are. So where are we? Well, the war between Israel and Hamas has entered its 29th day. 9,257 Palestinians have died in the Gaza Strip. 23,516 people have suffered injuries. 1,400 Israelis have been killed in Israel, of which 31 were children, and 3,826 Palestinian children are now dead. The war in Ukraine has entered its 619th day. Since the war started to the end of September, a minimum of 22,000 civilian casualties have been recorded, of which 7,500 are dead. Further to this, a minimum of 500,000 people from either Ukrainian or Russian military services are dead. The war in Yemen has been going on for 9 years, 1 month, 2 weeks, and 5 days. A minimum of 377,000 people have been killed through direct or indirect causes as a result of war. Those are only 3 of the 27 conflicts currently in progress that have been identified by the Global Conflict Tracker. In 2022, 61 journalists lost their life working in areas of conflict around the globe. Between 2012 and 2022, at least 1,910 environmental defenders, 34% of which came from local indigenous communities, were killed. So before we go any further into exploring a theology shaped by reason, experience, and more, let's hold 30-second silence and hold the world that is broken before God. Thank you. It felt like that silence could go on longer, but unfortunately time is slightly against us. Each one of those situations I have named sees the ultimate cost being paid in carbon emissions, civilian deaths, and financial resources diverted from being able to support their local population. If all of the conflicts stopped, it's likely between 30 and 40% of them will restart. And that's either interstate conflicts or conflicts between states and non-state actors. To be blunt, we live in a violent world that is deeply hurting. And that's why projects such as Justice Seeking Church are so important. Because if we keep our eyes fixed on a new Jerusalem we seek to build, we must also join Jesus in weeping over Jerusalem or the world as a city, as it scars and hurts itself in its current formation. As Fellowship of Reconciliation member Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, there is a sort of poverty of the spirit which stands in glaring contrast to our scientific and technological abundance. The richer we have become materially, the poorer we have become morally and spiritually. We have learnt to fly the air like birds and swim the sea like fish, but we have not learnt the simple art of living together as brothers. So let's think more about what a Methodist witness to peace could be about. And let's start where the Methodist story begins, with brothers John and Charles Wesley. Now, as both Mr. McQuibben and Brian Beck have analysed in various different papers, the legacy of the Wesley brothers is a difficult one for the Methodist Church in the UK to know and own. Sometimes it's, as Brian Beck memorably said, the embarrassing uncle that everyone knows there, but no one knows how to talk to. Or as Tim McQuibben pointed out, actually, if we don't know the roots from which we come from, we'll never understand where we go next. Now, starting off as a peace person, it can be quite tricky. John Wesley didn't helpfully write an entire sermon or treatise on war. But if you go into his sermon on original sin, you soon discover he did not like war. And surely all declamations on the strength of human reason and the eminence of our virtues are no more than the cant and jargon of pride and ignorance, so long as there are such a thing as war in the world. So long as this monster, war, stalks uncontrolled, where is reason, virtue, humanity? Later on, he also explores the futility of having 40,000 people sat either English or French in a field. What harm have they done to them? None at all. They do not so much as know them. But a man who is king of France has a quarrel with another man who is king of England. So these Frenchmen are to kill as many of these Englishmen as they can to prove the king of France is right. Now, what argument is this? He wasn't the most gentle, kind, or democratic of people, or the useful peace virtues. But I think on the human futility of war, Mr. Wesley nails it. But for those who prefer Charles, don't worry. The brother's pen was equally poised. Messiah, Prince of Peace, where men each other tear, where war is learned they must confess, thy kingdom is not there. Who prompted by thy foe, delight in human blood, Apollyon is their king, we know, and Satan is their god. For some reason, that hasn't made the hymn book since about 1850. So actually what we realise is we stand in a movement that, while it may not have abjectly rejected war, was very happy to actually embrace and explore the human futility of war from its outset. If you want to go into the ins and outs, then you pick up Hughes's Conscience and Conflict, Methodism and Peace in the 20th Century. It provides quite an easy digest of the 4 stages: early years, Victorian Empire era, the era between the 2 world wars, and the current era post 9/11, as to what peace and Methodism can be about. I want to tease out just a couple of small things to think about. The emergence of the nonconformist conscience in the middle of the 1800s was a key moment. And it's really interesting that by the end of the 1800s, you did have the emergence of a nonconformist peace society. At its forefront was a hero of mine who we saw on the board earlier, Mr. Hugh Price Hughes. He hated war. He railed against it. And then the Boers got in a bit of a war with the English. And this man who had so many good assets but was a bit too much of an imperialist, had a very big moral dilemma. He doesn't phrase it like this, but I'll shorten to in effect. If the cleansing and positive British Empire, as he would perceive it, is about to be stopped, maybe we need to pick up weapons and stop the stoppers. And he wasn't the only one who could grasp that idea of a world without war until there was just that one moment that for some reason things had to change. Another man I'm also a fan of is Arthur Guthrie, a primitive Methodist writer, thinker, leader of the Missionary Society, who was once famed to have never wasted a word or found an opportunity to speak. He used to rail against the huge sums spent in the 1910s as the arms race in its modern form, spent on machines, military and weapons, really got into gear. And I thought I had a beautiful quote here, but I think I've cut it. He railed hard against it, filling meeting after meeting of about 2,000 to 3,000 people at the annual Primitive Methodist Conference. But then when the war started, completely changed. And within about 2 weeks was talking about how, yet again, in effect, this was a civilizing force and war was good and we should all get behind it. And isn't that a good thing? But sometimes people who advocate for war and see situations emerge take a different approach. In the 1930s, Reverend Henry Carter, secretary to the newly formed Temperance and Social Welfare Department, did some pretty transformative things. He kept Methodist perspectives on peace and pacifism on the table and active within the Methodist Conference in a way that enabled a multitude of perspectives to be seen, reflected, and heard. But he also looked to many of the different human impacts of war and conflict. He took a church's delegation to the Spanish Civil War and reported back on what he saw. He listened carefully to the stories of suffering within Germany and ensured action for children were part of the Kindertransport process. And unfortunately, that's not really something we talk about much. He spoke out against the evils of Nazism while also trying to advocate peace, pacifism, and non-violence. But within our pulpits, there was also something different happening by the 1930s. Men who had lived through the First World War were arguing against it. Wesleyan Reverend Leslie Weatherhead wrote in 1929, "The younger generation knew little of the wickedness and waste of war, which was utterly unchristian, and suggested medals awarded in war signified murder, mutilation, tears, treachery, lust, and lies." Reverend Jimmy Butterworth, who led transformative youth work, including of Michael Caine, in the East End of London, declared at the outbreak of war in 1939 he would not allow his pulpit to be used as the same recruiting station he had seen in the previous war, or to promote the war. The Methodist engagement in questions of war and peace seems to rise and fall in terms of what it looks for, how it responds. But within all of it, you continue to discover that it's the personal response. What have we seen? What have we felt? What does that then mean? One of the ways this has been longest explored has been through the story of conscientious objectors. Now, a small print is if I say conscientious objector, some of you will think people who just absolutely reject war, and that is only part of the story. There is a huge spectrum within the world of conscientious objection. But the first one I'd like to talk about is someone who isn't often talked about and lived in the 1700s. Stonemason and lay preacher John Nelson was an early local preacher. But because early Methodists were particularly unpopular, in an era where people were recruited to the military by press gang, who I suspect, and I'm sure historians would slightly argue, sort of hired thugs to haul people off to the military, it turned out your local Methodist who turned up, caused trouble, was a good person to suggest to the press gang, you might like to take them. And he ended up in military barracks, refused to put on a uniform, and depending on which account you read, so I've read some FOR material, which talks of him as a proud peace person. And then I've read a book from the early 1910s by someone who was very keen on Methodism in the military, who talks him up as doing lots of good things within the military, albeit under duress. He certainly wasn't keen to be there to some extent. And who did he get to advocate for him? Well, here's an interesting one. Both Charles Wesley and the Countess of Huntingdon are in the paper trail of people who advocated that he had a greater cause to be acting for. And he himself writes about how his own ministry and preaching was wanting to turn people towards God. He didn't want to be in this military barracks. He preached while he was there, but he wanted to be taking people towards God. Now, the really difficult bit, and this is part where we come back to some of the previous conversation, is he was released, hooray, but only after London Methodists had traded another Methodist in to take his place. Tricky. But it's interesting that Charles Wesley, a man who also at one point wrote a letter in support of a transsexual woman, seemed to take an interest in many of the outworkings of faith. And I didn't have time to actually go into the archives at all or correspond with people to see what of any paperwork exists, whether it was simply an oversight question of, here we have an active preacher, how are they? Or was it something that took him deeper? If we scroll forward to the First World War, then we have someone similar but different. Robert Wright, primitive Methodist from Ormskirk. He kept a diary, which I've always found quite moving. December 31st. Another year is closing, and a great European war is raging. It's a great disappointment to me to leave my Christian work. During the last year, I have preached and given addresses no fewer than 88 times. We're all praying this awful war should end. May this Christmas be the last when the birth of the Prince of Peace is stained with the sacrifice of innocent men and women no more. Unfortunately, 1917 saw him confined to military barracks. March the 3rd, Saturday. Refused military parade at Pembroke Dock. Knocked about. Finally brought before commanding officer. Dismissed for a time. Sang in the YMCA hut at night to about 300 soldiers. And then he goes on. March the 11th. This evening I sang to soldiers in the guardroom and also bade farewell to a CO on his departure for prison. March the 12th. Again this evening we sang hymns with the soldiers in the guardroom. And then this is a man who was, being roughed up by the military police, not being looked on well, among the very people that, if you look at broader conversation, might have said would not look well on him because they were all going through military training. March 13th. For a few days now, the soldiers have desired me to preach in the evening. So after we'd sung a hymn, I took a text from Hebrews 12 and preached. The scene was interesting. In the guardroom, the windows are near the top. The only light available at night is an open gas light fixed in the wall. While I preached, there was some standing and some smoking on the wooden beds. I shall never forget the experience. After the sermon, I had a long discussion with others on Christ. I could go on, but I won't, partly because I might cry, but also because each one of those little diary entries is as powerful as those. There is something beautiful about the way people have individualized and taken into themselves the Methodist message. And that's not because someone came up and preached a sermon to them. It's because through the Methodist lay preaching process in particular, but also through the class system, the entire church was being challenged to say, what do you think about this? What does it mean to you? What does your experience of living in the world today mean for you and your faith? Of course, if you read broader, you discover that some people tick religious and just try to get off and all sorts of things. But there's a real fragility in there that you don't find in many other places. The other side, of course, which is worth thinking about, is when the church at a national level pivots between we like peace and war happens, isn't it bad, is how much of that is continuing a long historic conversation about the need for respectability. So the Methodist movement, similar to the Quakers, came about and sort of had to find opportunities to reliably pledge its allegiance to the monarch to enable it to practice. That's why the Quakers are one of the few bodies to get a specific invitation to bring a personal address to the king when he started. And I think of that when I pick up things like the Methodist Recorder this week and see the head of the military chaplaincy unit stood beside the Queen's consort. It's challenging, but I think if instead of looking to binary answers, we look to recognize and celebrate a breadth of perspectives on peace, we might begin to get somewhere. Returning to Guthrie, this was when he was in his more warmongering phase, he writes, "The Church, however patriotic, cannot escape the duty of protecting those who base their passive resistance on loyalty to Christ. They may be troublesome, they may be misguided, but to shoot one honest man with the love of Christ in his heart is an infamy. We have no sympathy with those who will not serve their nation in some way or another, but to force a rifle upon men who believe it's forbidden by their Lord is intolerable." And if you look further forwards to the 1950s, what you discover is a very similar piece of paper coming out from the sort of successor, the Division for Social Responsibility, MAYC, and the Fellowship of Reconciliation, where the then head writes very similarly, "Those of your friends in the church who wish to object because of their conscience need to be supported and upheld by their church because we respect that, not necessarily because we all agree." Now, a lot of what I have shared is probably fairly recognizable to any of you who've dabbled a bit in the corners and understandings of a peace witness. But the peace witness of the church did not end with the end of conscription. We saw since then other forms exist. The headline has been the sort of traditional to and fro over the presence of nuclear weapons, where the church seems to tie itself up in all sorts of knots about being pastorally responsible in areas such as Barrow-in-Furness, where the military weapons are created, without also trying to be pastorally responsible to people who live in this country, who are friends and family and nations in which conflicts are breaking out. But I think if we look broader, what we'll find is the broader spread of peace and justice and the way it intertwines has shaped in particular our work on anti-racism. If you look within the history within the UK Methodist Church and take, for example, my home district, the Birmingham Methodist District, you'll see in the 1950s and 60s, they recruited a minister specifically to work and welcome migrant communities coming into Birmingham. That was partly done because if you read up some of the writing, people are saying there will be conflict, there will be disagreement, and actually we need to be opening our arms and welcoming those of different perspectives. A different way some of that conversation has gone on has also been people, usually the white missionaries being sent to other countries around the world, seeing times of transition, in particular the changing from being colonial countries to independent countries in Ghana and in Zambia, which were non-violent transitions, coming back and saying, actually, there is a different story being written in certain countries to those that you hear in a pro-empire media in the UK who are predicting all sorts of horrors. And I think for me, some of this crossover and intersectionality is where we need to begin to take a modern peace witness. If I'm truly honest in my Methodist reading of scripture and wish to reject violence, turn towards love and bring God's kingdom here, I cannot allow the institutions of violence to continue. They may not be the sort that historically have been recognized, but they still exist. Racism, sexism. But alongside that, we also need to recognize we're still one of the biggest arms dealers in the world. We've happily cut the international development budget while finding £4 billion in lethal aid. And if you don't know what that nice phrase means, it means stuff that kills, to send to Ukraine. We've seen multiple churches stand up and lament the war in Ukraine, lament the war in Palestine and Israel. But how many have stood up and said, we need to be getting heads back round the table. We need a ceasefire in both situations. We need the long, hard work of building peace. We need £4 billion worth of loving aid for that instead. Maybe we don't say that because as a church, we still want an air of respectability. We look at our shrinking and think, if only we say just the right thing in just the right way, suddenly we'll be seen and respected in the way that Donald Soper was. Ah, wait, if you look at what he said, people didn't really like it, but he knew what he believed. He knew where his fire came from. He lit it, and he let the world decide what they made of it. Touch the earth lightly, use the earth gently, nourish the life of the world in our care. Gift of our great wonder, ours to surrender, trust for the children tomorrow will bear. We who create hunger, agents of death for all creatures that live, we who still foster clouds of disaster, God of our planet, forestall and forgive. Fragile, beautiful words, lament and hope, carried in the current Methodist hymn book. A hymn written in New Zealand to reflect upon a history of nuclear testing in the Pacific, which few people talk about. Why? Because that's why the test happened over there. It's over there, nothing to do with us. But the nuclear peace which some people cling to is built upon the poisoning of oceans, the poisoning of people, and willful ignorance of its impact. But if we look more deeply at the nuclear weapons testing issue, you discover what a modern peace witness is about. It's about repenting and recognizing as a nation we created and committed wrongs. It's about reparations and recognizing the live conversation within the situation around slavery is not just about that. Loss and damage fund is a form of reparations within climate. Reparations for people who've lost out on health and other reasons because of nuclear testing. And then it's about renewal. For as long as we allow the scandal of nuclear weapons to exist, we permit the potential of immense human catastrophe over the one planet we have. So we need to take time and space to imagine a different way. I think it was the first talk we had maybe where it talked about the church as one of the few spaces where that is allowed to happen. And for me, part of the urgency of our peace witness is there are very few places where people allow the idea of peace to be nurtured and discovered. And that's why we need to broaden our understanding of what peace means, to allow everyone to discover their peace story. Some of you will have had this little blue booklet passed around. It was produced between us and the Student Christian Movement earlier this year, available from the FOR bookshop for free online. You can order bulks of 10 or 25. We sent them out to our members, a little personal prompt, and had a most beautiful response. I had a small card, it's always those that get you, a small handwritten card where someone's really made an effort. They said, thank you very much for this. I meet with a small group of women from country X. They're hurting deeply because of the violence that's happening there at the moment. And your book is enabling them to hold that pain in prayer. There is a real risk because a lot of peace people are white, that we forget about the different nations, perspectives, understandings of the broader church. And I think we need to make sure within the peace work, we recognize the different communities who not only live within the UK, but also are found very much within our church. People whose stories trace back to other parts, communities, and countries that are still in conflict. And just because I can't be called up tomorrow doesn't mean that we should allow the military system to continue, because actually it is harming people in other places. But we also need to provide those spaces to lament, to hurt, and to refresh. this year it appears the must-have book is a small one brought out by Leslie Newton. It's the sort of book which happens about every 20 years in Methodism. Someone writes a good book about why Methodism not only should exist, does exist, but what it can do to keep on going. And one of his most astute observations at the start is a lot of corporate and institutional energy is going on to the how and the what. If you look at things like our calling and things, they're great, but they're all about process and sort of output. What there isn't as much of is the why. And I think if we're to be active for peace, we need to spend more time in the why. Not just why do we allow violence to happen, but why do we want peace? What beauty, wonder, and hope is out there? I've had the privilege of working with Anglesey Museum of Primitive Methodism to put together a couple of workshops on peace. I did the first one this week at a primary school, year sixes, so sort of 10, 11-year-olds. And I thought, right, we'll ask them what peace is. I was fully expecting no war, and that was about it. I had 32 different descriptions and understandings. Freedom, love, hope, wonder, friendship. These were all wonderful things. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about peace. So I'm sorry this hasn't been the most polished. There's been a war in Gaza and I've been coordinating a letter between people. We've been out on the streets. We've been using Zoom and other methods to connect with conscientious objectors from Ukraine and Belarus to advocate for their voice. But at its heart, we've been trying to look to that new kingdom that we're all seeking to build. That's encapsulated in these principles. It's one of beauty and peace. There's a beautiful hymn, which I always think of as the carousel hymn, because if you get a good chapel singing it, then you end up with sort of parallel verses going. I've got the text here to finish with. The chorus is, "Come, let us sing praise to the King, Jesus our King, Jesus our King. This is the King to whom we belong. Glory to Jesus our King." It captures a warmth, it captures a hope. But there's also a most beautiful line, "All shall be well in the kingdom of peace." And that's what we're about. God's kingdom, a kingdom of peace that we can create if we put our energy in. Thank you.